Go for it.
Hi, everyone. We are so happy to have you here today. I'm Carol Considine, the Director of Applied Projects in the Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience. We have over 100 registrations for this seminar, so we're really excited about that. Please put your name, your organization, and what sector you work in the chat so that we can build community across this seminar. The Coastal Virginia Adaptation and Resilience Consortium would like to thank the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and specifically Christy Everett for partnering with us for this fall seminar series. We're really excited about it. I also want to make you aware of two additional upcoming opportunities. The College of William and Mary Virginia Coastal Resilience Collaborative is hosting an event on October 3rd titled Securing Virginia's Future National Perspectives on State and Local Resilience Finance. And I'll put a link to that registration page in the chat for you. And also, the Hampton Roads region is celebrating the 10th year anniversary of the Dutch Dialogues on November 5th through the 7th. So, that registration page should go live later this week. The conference is going to focus on celebrating the resilience work that was completed in the last 10 years and provide opportunities for participants to share thoughts about what the future in the region should look like. So I again will send that information out to all the COVA A and R members via email. So again, just a huge thank you to the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and Christy Everett for partnering with COVA A and R on this seminar series. And now I'm going to turn this over to Christy.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Carol. The series is proudly sponsored by CBF, Coastal Virginia Adaptation and Resilience Coalition, and the Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Research, three organizations committed to advancing sustainable community-driven solutions for the region. This is a first in a series of 3 webinars this fall to bring technical knowledge regarding green infrastructure to the community. We should have time for questions at the end, so please enter your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom tool. Thank you for tuning in today. This important topic, marsh loss and finland placement, are 2 critical issues in the coastal resilience and habitat restoration space at this time. Marshes are critical ecosystems that provide flood protection, water filtration, carbon sequestration, and habitat for fish, birds, and other wildlife. However, marshes are increasingly threatened by sea level rise, erosion, subsidence, and human development. Thin layer placement is a restoration technique where a thin layer of sediment, often dredge materials, placed on degraded marshes to raise elevation, improve resilience to sea level rise, support vegetation growth, and extend marsh longevity. It's considered a nature-based solution and often used in areas where marshes are drowning due to rising seawater levels and sediment starvation. I'm excited today to have 3 experts that will share some insight in this issue. Ella will give a broader overview of the topic, and then Hunter and Gina will talk more specifically about some projects they're working on and planning that take this practice and bring it to Virginia. I'd like to start with introducing Ella DiPetto. Ella is an environmental project manager at the Elizabeth River Project. She's also a PhD candidate in ecology at Old Dominion University. Her research focuses on the social and ecological benefits of coastal nature-based solutions. While at ERP, she works on projects that address coastal resilience, such as advancing the application of thin layer placement techniques in Virginia. I'll turn it over to Ella to speak and present her slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. All right, hopefully you all can see my slides. Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to CBF, COVA, and ICAR for putting this series together. Like Christy said, my name is Ella, and I'm here to kind of orient us all to exactly what thin layer placement is. So we're all starting out on the same playing field and what that also might look like in Virginia. And then I'll pass the mic to some other really exciting presentations. So, as Christy mentioned, coastal wetlands are among the most valuable natural assets we have here in the state. Functionally, they operate as frontline infrastructure, attenuating wave energy, reducing flooding, and filtering excess nutrients and sediments. They sequester carbon at rates comparable to rainforests. They provide essential nursery habitat for more than 3/4 of our commercially important fish and shellfish species, and they're really important for recreation. But these services aren't static, so the US alone loses around 80,000 acres of our coastal wetlands each year, And Virginia specifically has lost roughly 42% of these wetlands that existed since the 1600s. This is largely due to anthropogenic development and land use conversion, but climate change is playing an increasingly important role. Wetlands are vulnerable to sea level rise, erosion, and sediment starvation, which means the services that we depend on are at risk unless we can strategically intervene. There are various practices that a lot of you all are familiar with to enhance coastal resilience by maintaining our natural coastal infrastructure so we can create new marshes, which allows us to establish new wetland acreage where it has been lost. Restoration improves degraded marshes so they can continue to deliver ecological and protective functions. The preservation of migration routes ensures there's a pathway for existing salt marsh to move inland with rising water levels, which we can do by prioritizing wetland conservation in areas with undeveloped upland or promoting upland conditions more conducive to marsh migration. In areas where marsh migration isn't possible, we can bolster the resilience of existing marshes to give them a leg up to rising waters. And one way to do this is through the practice of thin layer placement, which is what this webinar series is all about. So thin layer placement, again, is a sediment strategy to restore or maintain a tidal marsh's elevation relative to sea level. Thin layer placement, or TLP, leverages a marsh's natural ability to withstand these large storm-driven forces and sediment deposits. So it mimics this natural process by applying thin layers of sediment to the marsh's surface. And I do want to note, again, that terminology is really important when we're considering thin layer placement. Thin can be centimeters or inches. It can also be up to 3 feet. So I think that's where some of the discrepancy is involved. And it's really specific that for each project, you are outlining exactly what your target goals and elevations are. Let's see if this will play. But again, the goal is to increase the marsh elevation to keep it in the relative range of sea level rise and at a thickness of sediment that does not transform the habitat's ecological function. And there are many ways and techniques for the application of thin layer placement, including low pressure pumping and high pressure spraying or rainbowing, which is illustrated in this video right here. Thin layer placement is one of many uses for dredge material. This broader concept of reusing dredge material is termed beneficial use and includes purposes such as habitat development, beach nourishment, and even solid waste management. In a beneficial use project, dredge material is used in a way that does not reduce the storage capacity of dredge material placement areas like Craney Island, right? Preserving the space for sediment that may not be suitable for beneficial use and needs to go into upland disposal. Beneficial use is intentional and deliberate and is contrasted with disposal of dredge material, which can take place upland or even offshore in open water. Disposal fully removes that sediment from the system. Like Christy mentioned, TLP also falls under the larger umbrella of nature-based solutions where natural and nature-based features are used in support of healthy and resilient societies. So this isn't necessarily a coastal term, right? We can have rain gardens or bioswales, but also some of the things that we're more familiar with, like living shorelines, wetland restoration. All of the examples on this slide, including thin layer placement, work towards the benefit of both people and nature. So an important note to touch on with regards to thin layer placement is sediment characterization. Over 50% of all sediment dredged by the Army Corps of Engineers is fine grain, so this silt and soft clay. They're the most common material excavated in maintenance and dredging. And so the question of how do we handle these specific types of sediments is really important. Silt and soft clay are more likely to be contaminated, especially if the dredging occurs adjacent to industrial activity or agricultural runoff. So whether you're a really developed watershed like the Elizabeth River Project or a more rural area, contamination and assessment of contamination levels is one of the various other soil characteristics and properties that need to be assessed before we can beneficially use sediment. And with softer sediments, another major concern is with the potential disruption of water quality and increased turbidity during construction. So containment is really, really critical during implementation. So to account for this fine-grained sediment, there are various methods of containment that can and have been used, including sandbags, biofiber materials like bales and core logs, turbidity curtains, hay and straw bales, and even oyster shell bags or existing shoreline protective features like sills and breakwaters. And the type of containment will depend on the proposed project and the site characteristics and is pretty varied if you look at existing case studies. Another thing to mention when thinking about thin layer placement as a resilience strategy is that it's not a one and done solution, but it can and should be an iterative management technique. So similar to beach nourishment, it can be repeated over time using distinct lifts of sediment. So in a hypothetical example on the left, we have a healthy natural marsh in teal and a controlled drowning or eroding marsh in that purple brown color. And the light green line indicates an eroding marsh that has undergone two separate lifts of sediment addition, indicated with those green arrows. So you can see an initial increase in elevation, but similar to the control and the natural reference marsh, because of rising waters and other factors, you will still get a loss in elevation over time. But repeating this technique can add years of resilience to the lifespan of a marsh. To put TLP in a larger perspective, the last decade has seen an emergence of guidance, site assessment protocols, and monitoring frameworks for thin layer placement across the national scale, but also state and local scales as well, including probably most prominently this top right, the guidelines for how to approach thin layer placement projects, the Army Corps of Engineers, and more recently, sediment strategies, which is this bottom middle document recently came out from the state of Maryland and has really amazing case studies. And also more recently, this includes the development of a Virginia-specific document that we're working on to be released this fall, which complements a larger effort in the state of Virginia discussing beneficial use at large by VMRC. So a few key items to kind of keep note of, and I'm happy to send links to any of these documents to whoever's interested. There have been numerous thin layer placement projects across the US coastline, kind of spearheaded by the Gulf Coast states, but more recently by our neighbors in the Mid-Atlantic. These are just two examples of projects in the Mid-Atlantic that have used fine-grained sediments for thin layer placement. And both of them had similar depth of placement around 4.5 inches, but they use different containment methods and different implementation methods. So these are just a quick snapshot. I encourage you to learn more about the many available example projects like these if you're interested. Again, that sediment strategies document has a really well laid out case study that even includes some lessons learned from each of these projects. So to kind of wrap things up, where are we now and where does Virginia fit into this picture? Virginia hasn't permitted or implemented a full-scale thin layer placement project in the state to date. So how can we get there? Coastal stakeholders are working on developing a shared understanding and to solidify regulatory framework for these types of projects to get permitted and constructed. This comes with a lot of challenges, like addressing how to deal with those finer grained sediments, but also things like how to align dredging operations with a restoration project in need of materials. But something that's really positive is there's a large consensus and a lot of momentum behind advancing thin layer placement in the state right now. And we can do this by, engaging in open dialogue and shared learning like we're doing right now. It also means taking successes and failures from other states so we could start on stronger footing. And we also need to get some pilot projects in the ground, right? We can take lessons from other states, but our ecology and our conditions here in Virginia are unique. And ultimately, we need to go out and learn some of those lessons ourselves. So a lot of this is happening right now. I will end by considering, if you want to learn more, consider attending the Thin Layer Placement Symposium next week, hosted by Elizabeth River Project with support from Chesapeake Bay Foundation. It will be at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's Brock Environmental Center next Friday, September 19th. It's going to be part of a 3-part series. The first one is, again, shared terminology, the state of the science and practice. And in the future, we're hoping to get a little bit more of a regulatory discussion workshop going. So if you're interested, would love to be involved, please reach out to me or Christy at CBF. Would love to see you there. And with that being said, I will pass it off. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ella. And we can include registration for the 19th in a follow-up email. And Ella, to your point about shared education, this will be recorded today. So we will send it out afterwards. If you want to share it with someone else that wasn't able to attend today, please do. Just thank you for your talk and your participating in all your work on this topic. Now we'd like to hear about more of a local project example. So we'll hear from Gina Dotolo, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. She's going to talk about the Crab Creek Lynnhaven Ecosystem Restoration Study. Gina is a biologist at the Norfolk District, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. She has worked as the environmental lead on a variety of civil work projects, including ecosystem restoration with a passion for tidal restoration. Gina graduated from University of Rhode Island with a bachelor's degree in wildlife conservation biology. They continued her studies at University of Delaware, earning a master's degree in energy and environmental policy. Gina's professional career started at the Charleston District, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, working in the regulatory section. She then moved to Virginia to work as a biologist in the planning and policy branch at the Norfolk District. She's gained experience working in and around the Chesapeake Bay on ecosystem restoration and habitat restoration projects. Gina, with that, I'll let you share screen and present. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, hopefully that worked. So my name is Gina Dotolo. I'm a biologist with the Army Corps of Engineers in Norfolk. I'm going to be discussing marsh elevation enhancement as a wetland restoration method on our phase 3 of our Lynnhaven River Basin Ecosystem Restoration Project. Marsh elevation enhancement involves raising a tidal marsh through addition of sediment, typically dredged material, to prevent marsh loss. This process can also be referred to as thin layer placement. Our project area is 6.6 acres and consists of a tidal marsh, adjacent mainland, and tidal creeks. And the City of Virginia Beach is our non-federal sponsor on this project. Oh, okay, so this is the agenda. I'm going to be discussing the project's background, some existing conditions at the wetland site, the proposed action and design, our study process, and then I'll briefly show another Army Corps example of thin layer placement in a marsh. At the bottom is the QR code for our project website in case anyone's interested in learning more information about the Lynnhaven River project that we have going on. So this project was originally developed in 2014 and consists of restoring 38 acres of tidal wetlands, 31 acres of reef habitat, and 94 acres of SAV. So far for wetlands, we've restored 5.5 acres under phase 1. Phase 2 plans to restore up to 21.8 acres and should be starting construction hopefully this fall. And then for phase 3, we plan to restore 6.6 acres. The entire Lynnhaven project was authorized by Congress in 2014 and fully funded in 2018. The purpose of this phase 3 wetland restoration project is to restore degrading salt marsh island and increase its resiliency to changing conditions. The need for this is because many tidal wetlands within the Lynnhaven River have been lost to urban development and sea level change. Vertical accretion is important to maintaining these marsh functions to prevent habitat loss from sea level change and subsidence over time. Because if the marsh plants can't migrate upwards, then they'll likely be lost in the future. So this slide shows our marsh island that we're planning to restore. In the photo on the left from 2002, you can see the middle area was historically vegetated with native salt marsh cordgrass. And then compared to the photo on the right, which is what it looks like today, you can see that the center has converted into mudflat and open water. So that is really the area we are targeting for marsh elevation enhancement to prevent continued loss of the vegetation on this island. These are some photos of the site taken last year. In the first two photos, you can see degradation and subsidence that's occurring. But in the photo on the all the way on the right, you can see a healthy marsh. So there are areas of the marsh island that are still vegetated. So we would want to try and avoid the healthy vegetation when doing dredge material placement. These are just some existing conditions of the marsh island. The vegetation is only smooth cordgrass. There's 60% of the area is vegetated, 40% is mudflat and open water, so non-vegetated. The soils there are Rappahannock mucky peat, and the existing elevation is 0.74 feet mean high water and minus 1.68 feet mean low water. We do have quite a few aquatic resources at this location. There are multiple oyster beds and mussels that were observed here, in addition to oyster reef sanctuaries and private oyster leases. High functioning oyster beds would want to be avoided as best possible during placement activities so as not to smother the oysters. We have done some mapping to try and get an idea of where the healthy vegetation was, which you can see in this first image here. We have about 2.4 acres of healthy vegetation, and then we used NOAA's intermediate sea level change curve to project that by year 2090, there would be about a 78% loss of existing vegetation due to sea level change. This kind of justifies the need for something to be done to stop this continued decline in vegetation, as the marsh plants are converted to mudflats and open water, if they can't keep up with the rate of sea level change. So our proposed action is to raise a portion of the island outlined here in this pink polygon. We want to raise it up to mean high water and a little bit above, and then we're going to plant high marsh species and saltbush species. So essentially, we'd be increasing the elevation in that middle area about 2 feet with dredge material in order to have the elevation suitable for high marsh species and a saltbush community. The idea is that if we can raise the elevation enough that as sea level continues to change, the existing low marsh vegetation will have the ability to migrate to higher ground and therefore reduce the amount of vegetation loss in the future. And then by planting different species, we increase habitat diversity within this marsh island as well. So this will involve placing about 11,600 cubic yards of material via floating pipeline, and our material source is Crab Creek Channel, which I will show on the next slide. During construction, we plan to use best management practices to reduce any impacts to existing healthy vegetation and oyster beds. So we want to use core logs and or something similar and turbidity curtains. Once the material is placed and settled, we will then plant high marsh species of Spartina patens and saltbush species, Iva frutescens, and Baccharis halmifolia. So our material source is likely coming from Crab Creek Channel. This is a channel that is annually dredged and maintained by the City of Virginia Beach. This channel produces about 15,000 cubic yards of sandy material, and it's located only 0.3 miles like northeast of our proposed placement area. So this slide just shows what kind of engagement and compliance we do during our studies. Since the feasibility report was completed in 2014, and this specific location was not originally identified in that previous report, so I've done supplemental NEPA on this new location. So some engagement activities include having biweekly team meetings with the non-federal sponsor. We do public meetings so we can gain comments from the public on what we are proposing. We've done workshops with experts in this field to gain insight on best approaches, and we've done a lot of coordination with other environmental agencies. And we've had discussions with oyster lease owners near that site to let them know kind of what's going on. And then for compliance, I have to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act and other federal environmental compliances, such as the ones that are listed here. This involves consulting with NOAA, with Fish and Wildlife Service, with the State Historic Preservation Office, Department of Environmental Quality, etc. So it's really a collaborative effort to complete these studies, and we have to make sure we take into account how our actions are impacting different resources. So currently, we are nearing the release of our draft supplemental environmental assessment, which will then go through approval to get to final release and eventually get to construction in January of 2028. And lastly, I wanted to show an example project done by the Savannah District. We are actually using this project as kind of a guideline for ours because they're similar in size and method. So this is Jekyll Creek Beneficial Use Pilot Project in Georgia. This project beneficially used non-beach quality dredge material from the AIWW to thin layer place 5,000 cubic yards of material on a 5-acre marsh at Jekyll Island. You can see Jekyll Island here in the first photo, and the placement area is the one outlined in red. The project was implemented in 2019, and they used an 18-inch pipe to place the material, and they used coconut core logs to contain the material. This project seems to have been quite successful, as you can see from the photos on the right, showing the difference from what it looked like in 2019 versus 2023. I also inserted a link to a YouTube video that just kind of goes over this project if anyone's interested. But overall, this project was successful and was quite a collaborative effort between multiple districts, agencies, and organizations. So collaboration is very important when we're doing projects like this, which is why we have a lot of meetings with agencies and we do site visits and we reach out to the public because we really want our projects to be as successful as they can be. And that's all I have for this. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Gina. And I'm seeing everyone's name and organization in the chat really have a breadth of expertise and perspectives here today. So thank you again to everyone who could join us in sharing that information. I don't see questions and answers yet. So please, if you have questions and answers, put them in the Q&A box, not necessarily the chat box, but the Q&A box. And then I did just put in the chat box information on the webinar on September 19th that Ella mentioned. And now I'd like to introduce Hunter. Hunter is a biologist with Ducks Unlimited, serving the South Atlantic region from Virginia to Georgia. How about that for a territory? This is quite significant. He currently resides in Providence, Fort Virginia, near his hometown. He earned a Bachelor of Science in Renewable Natural Resource Ecology and Management from Louisiana State University in 2020. Following his undergraduate studies, Hunter worked as a research technician on multiple projects with the Louisiana Department of Wildlife Resources, Mississippi State University, and State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, SUNY ESF. He later joined SUNY ESF as a graduate student, earning a Master's of Science in November 2024. His thesis focused on eastern mallard morphology and genetics, specifically examining the genetic introgression of feral game farm mallards in the eastern United States. Outside of his professional work, Hunter married in December 2024 and lives in a small hobby farm with his wife and 5 dogs. So Hunter, I don't know if you're home, but if we hear some barking, I'm assuming it's the 5 dogs. So with that, I'll turn it over to Hunter to describe another local Virginia project that you're working on to pursue thin layer replacement here. Thanks so much.
Thank you for that intro, Christy. I'm actually in the state of Maine right now at the Atlantic Flyway Council meeting. So I'm getting a little bit different scenery up here. So no dogs, but we'll get this pulled up. All right, so I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit today about a project that Ducks Unlimited actually recently completed in June of this year at Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge, specifically our Assateague Channel restoration, so up in Accomack County, Virginia, working directly with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as part of a cooperative agreement to kind of take on a tidal marsh restoration in the northern part of the refuge. So just to start with a little bit of background about this project, this was a 2-phase project consisting of our work on Assateague Channel at Chincoteague, as well as decommissioning 2 historic waterfowl impoundments in Sow Pond and Lighthouse Meadow, which are also both further south on the refuge. This particular cove is located off of Assateague Bay, kind of on the northwestern part of the refuge. And it is an area of the refuge that is outside of public access besides bike access. So we have this service road right here off to the side of the project site. If you go back and you look at historic imagery, and I can kind of show you guys on my screen here, but if you go back and look at the historic imagery of this site, these oyster castles were not actually installed until 2016, but historically, the tidal marsh in this area extended out to those oyster castles. Over time, as a result of erosion and storm effects, and then overgrazing from actually Chincoteague ponies, this channel that you can see in the imagery here filled in up against the service road, and over time that marsh began drowning as that water was being held up against the service road in that channel. So Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge approached us with kind of this idea to restore this tidal marsh, and as you can see, the majority of it is open water now. So one of the best ways to do that, of course, would be to bring in sediment and kind of rebuild that marsh platform. So this project was actually part of the Hurricane Sandy relief funds, and Ducks Unlimited drafted a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to do this work, and we were granted around $2.2 million to complete this project. Phase 2, which is this specific Assateague Channel part of the project, actually ended up going first, and Phase 1 is set to begin in January of 2026. So just kind of getting into the design and permitting surrounding the project, some of the technical specifications. The original goal of this project was for all of the sediment used in this marsh platform restoration to have come from existing dredge sites, spoil piles. The main spoil pile that we had planned to use for this project, and this kind of goes back to some of the discussion that Ella presented, was actually located next to Chincoteague Marina. And we went out and did an analysis of that spoil site, and it was very clay-like, expansive material with obvious, not only physical instances of, garbage, trash being in the dredge, but also the sediment itself had a very strong petroleum-like smell. So we didn't feel comfortable using that material as part of this project on the refuge. So we actually ended up having to import over 14,000 cubic yards of sand material from another source. So all of that material was trucked in and then spread with machinery in the marsh itself. So going off of that, you can kind of see here our planting grades here. We actually ended up following 1.25 feet for the low marsh, and then moving up into there, of course, Spartina patens being your low marsh species, and Spartina alterniflora being your high marsh species. So that was really the composition of the planting. We had around 6 acres of direct disturbance, and we expect that 6 acres of disturbance to restore around 18 acres of marsh up to those oyster platforms over time. Kind of getting into the permitting process, this is the fun stuff. We were granted a nationwide 27 permit by the U.S. Corps of Engineers. This whole project went through the standard joint permit application process. So if you're not familiar with that, you fill out one application. The project is then sent to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Local Wetland Board, DEQ, and VMRC. All review the project kind of in turn. So after we got that nationwide 27, which is just your aquatic habitat restoration activities permit, VMRC then followed that up with the tidal wetlands permit. And we actually received an exemption from DEQ for this specific project under Section 62, which just kind of covers shoreline erosion projects. So there is an exemption for that in the DEQ legislation. And then we're not required to get a permit from the Local Wetlands Board. But of course, this kind of can vary from project to project based off of the specifics and what's in your erosion and sediment control plan. Going specifically looking at the erosion and sediment control plan, that's actually a reason that this project got started a little bit later than we had planned. So the grant for this project was actually awarded in September 2023. We went through all of the normal permitting with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service kind of heading that up. And we had planned to start in January 2025. Well, then it came back from DEQ that we had not received erosion and sediment control permits. And we don't really know where that oversight happened. That was before my time with the U. But we had to go back and do our erosion and sediment control permits, which of course comes with a 45-day review. Um, and we were ended up being granted those in late April or early April and started construction in late April. And I will say that we're starting to see that erosion and sediment control plans need to be much more detailed in the state of Virginia, and those reviewers are really starting to look for a lot of detail that kind of explains exactly what you're doing. So you can see an example of one of our plans here from DU's engineering team that kind of outlines everything. And this image, of course, is a part of a much larger package that has to be submitted in order to secure your erosion and sediment control permits. So, as I said, construction on this project started in late April, went throughout all of May, and we actually wrapped it up in June 2025 with plantings. So here's some of that construction work in May. This is actually from early May. And it's important to note that all of the work for this project was conducted off of the service road. So that kind of helps as well. So all of this work was conducted off the service road. We had easy access. So you can kind of see here the machinery working, and then you can see the expanse of that restoration. And then this is actually a really cool image. This shows the completed project. You can see all the plantings here. You can see the intermix zone. You can see your low marsh or high marsh. And it also presents a rather unique or a rather unique problem that we were facing with this project. Um, we were ensured that the horses would be kept out of this area at completion of the project, but as you can see, they don't really follow the rules. So you can just kind of see the completed project here. You can see our erosion and sediment control core logs out at the extent of the project here. And yeah, you know, it was a successful project. This image was actually from 2 weeks ago, and it seems like the vegetation is still kind of transitioning, figuring out those zones as the tide goes up and down. So we were happy with this project, and we'll continue to monitor it for another year or so. And while I'm here with this pretty image in front of you guys, just to add some regional input, as Christy said, I do cover from Virginia south to Georgia. Um, and these conversations about thin layer placement, trying to get these projects into the works, is becoming a growing discussion across my entire region. I've been in multiple meetings with Audubon Society, Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point here recently about how to institute sediment management plans, thin layer placement projects across these states. It's something that's going to be very big in South Carolina, something that's growing in North Carolina. But I will say it seems to me that Virginia is a little bit ahead in our planning process and how we are able to implement these projects here going forward. So, that's something that I see as positive. Ducks Unlimited, of course, is involved in a lot of these projects in the Gulf Coast states as well as the Northeast, which Ella kind of highlighted as well. So it's nice to kind of see this idea getting the interest that it does here in our South Atlantic region. So yeah, any questions?
Thank you so much, Hunter. And I believe Kate, my colleague at CBF, is going to spotlight all three of us. We've got questions for you, Hunter, but also for Ella and Gina. So maybe we'll take them all together in case there's follow-up comments from the other panelists. Okay, I think we're all here. So thank you all for submitting the questions. Got some good ones in here. Question for Gina first. The proposed action would replace the existing low marsh habitat for fish with 100% high marsh habitat, which fish are less likely to use. Is there a way to create a gradient with the thin layer placement where you wouldn't convert all of the existing low marsh habitat to high marsh habitat?
Sure. We are not converting all of the low marsh habitat. There's going to be 2.4 acres of existing low marsh habitat that will remain. We are focusing on the areas that are unvegetated that were previously vegetated. So we're focusing on the mudflat and like open water areas to raise the elevation there. to and then plant the high marsh and saltbush community. But so there will be low marsh, high marsh, and saltbush species within the island. Yep.
Great. And Hunter or Ella, if you want to add on anything, please feel free. Okay. There was a question about how deep is a placement. Gina, I think that was during your presentation.
I'm not sure what that means.
Okay. Let's come back to that one. And if somebody wants to clarify a little bit more, or maybe it was in regards to Hunter's. Another question that came in, Gina, during your presentation, the tidal range at Jekyll Island is larger than in Virginia Beach. Given success in Georgia so far, how are you thinking performance might compare in Virginia?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping it'll be similar, but as we continue to develop the actual design of this project, we will definitely be having our engineers look into that, the tidal ranges and how we go about doing the placement.
Question came in, I believe, during Ella's presentation. Someone had asked about the comparison in terms of thin layer placement and MEE, mean ecosystem elevation. So anyone can comment on that if they'd like, but Ella, I think that was probably intended for you.
Yeah, I noticed that Gina was using Marsh Elevation Enhancement, MEE, and I think we've gone back and forth with that terminology. Some people are a little bit more comfortable with Marsh Elevation Enhancement rather than thin layer placement because, again, thin is very vague. So I think right now it seems to be sectorial preference or organizational preference. I don't know if any of the other speakers have anything to add, but it seems like thin layer placement was kind of the first initial terminology, and everyone's trying to kind of improve on that to make it a little bit more clear.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting because we're actually doing another project on Chickadee National Wildlife Refuge, restoring Swan Cove, and that involves bringing in sediment as well. And we're hesitant to call it thin layer placement because it is a little bit deeper, a little bit more sediment being brought in. So actually, the 3 feet standard is something I wasn't familiar with. So I think we could probably call that thin layer placement now.
I think for my project in specific, because it's part of a bigger ecosystem restoration project that has the wetland component to it, is why we leaned more towards marsh elevation enhancement rather than calling it thin layer placement. But I think we're only planning to place about 2 feet of sediment, so it would stay within the 3 feet. Yep.
Okay. And there's a question, Hunter, about Hurricane Aaron at the planting or erosion control as it passed a few weeks ago.
You were cutting out really bad.
Hunter,
Could
could
you
you do
repeat that,
that?
please? Yeah.
Like you. Sorry, okay, let me repeat it. Hopefully you can hear now. As hurricane passed a few weeks plantings. Oh, I think I lost service there for a minute. Can you hear me now? Okay, let me try again. Did Hurricane Aaron affect the plantings or erosion control practices as it passed by a few weeks ago?
I actually haven't been out there since Hurricane Aaron came through. I haven't heard anything from the refuge either, so I don't believe so. We've been scoping projects down at Pea Island National Wildlife Refuge, and they definitely got hit a little bit harder than us, but even their effects weren't that great. So I wouldn't expect many effects at all at Chincoteague.
Okay, great. And Hunter, one more question for you. What type of monitoring requirements do you have from the Corps or VMC?
So, this is something that I'm kind of trying to change a little bit within the DU framework. Ducks Unlimited typically doesn't do much monitoring. That usually falls on the the organization. So say, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, our partner organization who's getting the work done. Um, this specifically monitoring from my standpoint was just based off of our engineers do get warranties on our plantings. So at a certain survival threshold, that's something that we need to be monitoring to make sure that those plants are surviving for that warranty purpose. As far as what agreement is in place with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, how they're going to monitor things, that's more that's more on their side of things. There are specific projects where we'll kind of work in actual monitoring, like we have other projects going on where I'll do a little bit more than that. So,
Thank you. And Ella, I believe this came in for you, but anyone could answer. The core logs used to contain sediment following placement or whatever appropriate barrier is used, is there a specific elevation threshold you're targeting for the tops of those barriers, like mean high water or something similar?
I think that was in response to, I think Gina mentioned that her project was using the core logs, but I think in general, you are trying to get mean high, but not in all cases. And it's really that period between placement and consolidation, which is generally a couple of weeks where that risk of turbidity is the highest, but different to others as well.
No, I agree with what you said, Ella.
Great. And then Hunter, you did mention what is the acreage of your project? And there was a comment of looks great, by the way. So I wanted to make sure you saw that comment. But
yeah, so it was 6 acres of disturbance, a little bit over 6 acres of disturbance, and we kind of expect that over time to result in around 18 acres of restored acreage just from sedimentation. And I forgot to mention that there is a channel along the southern end of the marsh that serves a water control structure for an impoundment on the other side of the road. So that channel was stabilized with actually logs that we took down on the refuge. So that channel was stabilized, and we kind of expect that to bring in some sediment and build in between the oyster castles as well. So.
and Hunter, can you speak more to the DEQ exemption you receive? Two follow-up questions. Did you encounter any hurdles with local zoning or Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act? Did you need solid waste permitting with DEQ? So there's a few there, and others can speak to their experience with those issues.
So solid waste, I have not heard anything about, so I would say no on that. This project was before my time with DU, so I've been trying to figure things out with the engineers, and then our engineer is also newer than me, so going above him is a little bit more difficult. But solid waste was definitely not something that we had to go through with. As far as the other things, that would be something that I could ask my our managing engineer. And if somebody wants to reach out with me those questions, I could get you an answer. So I think I answered all of your question there. Was there any?
Okay, great. And Ellen, you can let us know if you have anything to add there. Okay. Ella, I think with your look at this as a broader issue, you may want to weigh in on this one, but Gina, since you represent the core, you might also have some insight depending on obviously what division hat you're wearing. But with the Lynnhaven project taking at least 3 years until install, the slow pace in the regulatory world, Virginia desperately needs re-engineering. Wouldn't the U.S. Corps of Engineers be able to assemble process engineers in a virtual room to reimagine a fast track process? All stakeholders could be represented, but time fences between decisions could be eliminated. Wouldn't the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers be in the best position to unravel this regulatory Gordian knot? Big question. And I know, Ella, you'll be sharing more information in their future seminar series on that, but you all have thoughts on that suggestion or question?
I guess I can speak from the core side. Yes, it is long, but we have our own like rules and regulations and guidance that we have to follow, and our process does take a long time. I wish it was quicker too, but we have to follow the process that we have laid out for these types of projects. So right now we are in feasibility phase, which is kind of, going through and developing what your idea is, and then we will move into our next phase of design, and then we kind of design it further, and then we'll, move into construction, and then after that we do adaptive management and monitoring. So it is a whole process, and it takes a long time.
Yeah, if I could just add something real quick. Not, definitely, Gina, these projects do seem to take a very long time. I mean, it was over a year for us to get these projects started, and that tends to be our timeline with a lot of these things. And then just one more note on that DEQ exemption. That specific exemption for shoreline erosion projects, you only get that if U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, VMRC, and the local wetland board has already reviewed and approved the project and kind of given you, their feedback on things. So that's how we were successful in getting that exemption.
And I'll just add that I am very sympathetic to the fact that permitting these projects can be a nightmare. And when we're focusing on habitat that is so vulnerable and so quickly eroding or drowning, it does feel very very pertinent to get these projects in the ground as fast as possible. I also will say, at least in Virginia, because this is not a commonplace resilience technique yet, there's a lot of uncertainty from the regulatory, but also the academic side and the academics that inform the regulations. So that's why I think we kind of have to start from the ground up. What do we need to know? What can we apply from other states? What can't we apply to other states? And once a few of these projects have been undergone through the permitting system with a lot of coordination and communication, I think it will, at least from the state and the local level, get a little bit easier. And I think that's just all about coming to the table and looking at the data and listening to people. So hopefully within the next couple years in Virginia, we really will kind of push the needle forward.
Thank you for those insights. With some of the projects that plan to use thicker layer placement, 2+ feet, are there concerns throwing off the chemistry of the marsh soils? I believe some of the past research has looked at acid sulfate soil issues in thickness over 6 inches. Whomever might have insight on that, or
That's a good question.
I can't really
Um,
speak to the chemical side of the sediments, but at least from the biological and vegetative side, thickness does matter in terms of natural revegetation versus having to plant. And if you're going to go a little bit thicker, you are likely going to have to plant, or there's going to be this interim period, maybe 1 to 3 growing seasons, where you don't have that natural revegetation. So at least from the vegetative side, there are some studies kind of trying to pin down that optimum vegetation thickness. There's still a lot to discover. But in terms of the chemistry, I think that is a broader question that does need a lot more research. Even adding a sandy, fine, thicker grain sediment to a marsh. I mean, we do that right now with living shorelines. We have clean sand fill that we put on top, and there's no kind of benthic activity in those for a while, up to a couple years. So I think the sediment chemistry is very important.
and at least for our project, I mean, the material we are hoping to use for placement is the same material that is probably makes up the marsh. It's all, right within the same kind of creek. And so I don't foresee there being some sort of issue with that. But yeah, like Ella said, depending on, I guess, the elevation you bring it up to. So we're bringing it up higher probably, which is why we're doing our plantings. And then we also look at like if the material could be contaminated. So we look at like hazardous, toxic, radioactive waste in the area and make sure we're not placing contaminated material. And then there are rules and regulations for placing material in a wetland. It has to go through testing. So we do all that kind of stuff. Mhm.
thank you. And a little bit more about the material. Henry, this question came in for you. The material seemed to be quite sandy. If you can just elaborate, where did the material originate, and was it from dredging or uplands?
Yeah, so actually, I meant to get that information from our engineer, but I'm being in Maine and stuff. I'm a little tied up. So that's another one that somebody could follow up with me from. I know that it was locally sourced. I do not believe that it was from a dredge project. And just kind of going from, sandy composition of soil, there are standards that we have to follow, kind of like Gina said. And with sand specifically, there are certain compositions that you have to hit in order to use that sediment for wetland projects. With the sandier soils, we have had issues in the past with establishing plants just from a nutrient standpoint. So it is a little bit more difficult to do plantings on this extremely sandy soil. So that is just something to kind of keep in mind, and kind of requires, in my opinion, more of a monitoring effort afterwards.
Great. Actually, one more question. This is the last question. And by the way, to your point of follow-up, if it's okay with the presenters, we can share your contact information and follow-up email. So, or you're welcome to put it in the chat as well if people are able to reach out to you with some of those questions that we didn't answer today. But the last question, and again, this is having to do with monitoring, turbidity monitoring. Do your thin layer replacement projects require turbidity monitoring during placement similar to a regular dredge project? In your experience, have turbidity curtains been necessary, or do the core logs provide enough containment?
I can speak to this. So turbidity, we use turbidity curtains with all of our projects. For S2 channel specifically, we did turbidity curtains, core logs. We actually did have the first core logs that we got had some issues with dissolving, just from wave actions and things like that. So we did upgrade those to, I couldn't tell you exactly what they were, but they worked a lot better. Um, and then also, it's important to keep in mind that if you're going to do any kind of stockpiling of sediment on site, you have to have some kind of silt fences in place to maintain the erosion, sediment deposition of those stockpiles. So, those are little things that DEQ has asked from us in the past that, people that are planning these projects keep in mind just to make things a little bit easier.
Thank you all so much. The participants, I'm sure you are giving you a round of applause right now. You all did an excellent job bringing this program and kind of topic to Virginia, making it very relevant and timely. So really appreciate your presentations, preparing for those, sharing your information. I know you're all busy. And then of course, answering all the technical questions. We answered all of the questions. So thanks again for working through that. Again, we'll send out this recording. Ella and I timed this webinar to make sure it's in advance of the one on the 19th. So if you're interested, take advantage of that. Space is somewhat limited, right, Ella? So please register if you're thinking about it and spread the word. And then we hope you'll join for the next one. October 8th will be our next in this series with COVA A&R and CBF, and that is Green Infrastructure Anticipated Needs in a Changing Landscape. And that's what David Wood from the Chesapeake Stormwater Network and Bill Sesnick with CDM Smith. So hopefully you can join for that. We will also send out evaluation after today as well. We want to hear your thoughts. This is something new we're doing as a partnership, and we're excited you're participating and taking your lunch hour to be with us and learn more. And really just thank you again, and hope to see you next time. Thanks so much to the speakers.